Thank you for joining Framework's introductory webinar. My name is Megan Mahoney, and I'm the Deputy Director of Framework at the International Rescue Committee. Framework is a labor trafficking focused training and technical assistance project that's funded by the Office for Victims of Crime. We work to support starting and seasoned service providers and their partners to identify and serve labor trafficking survivors through remote and in-person services. Hopefully one day we'll be providing in-person services. We're at a really exciting moment in the project where we're moving from planning to implementation, and we know that there's a lot of energy and a lot of interest in labor trafficking out there. So know that we're here to provide the kind of support that amplifies that energy and equips you to address this issue in your communities with a framework, if you will, of sound knowledge, sharp skills, effective tools, and confidence in your abilities. So before we get started, we have just a few housekeeping items for you. This 1-hour webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to you along with a transcript following the event. All attendees are currently muted, and to switch between phone and computer audio, you can go ahead and click on audio settings. We welcome your questions and comments throughout the duration of the presentation. And we invite you now to click the little chat bubble and select all panelists and attendees to share with us your name, your agency, and the city that you're participating from. To ask questions, you can go ahead and click the Q&A button. And if you see a submitted question that you would also like answered, feel free to upvote it by clicking the little thumbs up next to that question. We'll address as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation, and we'll also be compiling an FAQ document that will circulate following the event with all the questions that we answered and the ones that we may not have gotten to. And lastly, we're going to be conducting just a few polls, so be prepared to participate. Next slide. So I'm joined today by my framework colleagues, Regina Bernardin, who's the technical advisor for anti-trafficking programs at the International Rescue Committee, and Charlie Borg, our program officer for training and administration at Framework. Today, we're going to start by providing an overview of the project. We'll move on to present the results from our labor trafficking needs assessment survey. We're going to talk through some of the priority topics in upcoming projects that are informed largely by feedback that we got from the survey. And then we'll have a little bit of time at the end for questions and answers. So by the end of the webinar today, you will be familiar with Framework and know how to connect with us. You'll have learned about the needs, priorities, and preferences of fellow service providers. And you'll have an understanding of what Framework resources will be available in the near future. So with that, I will turn it over to Regina to walk us through the Framework overview.
Thank you, Megan. Next slide, please, actually. Thank you. So welcome, everyone. For some context, Framework is a program of the International Rescue Committee. The IRC is a worldwide leader in humanitarian response and refugee resettlement, serving vulnerable populations in 40 countries and over 20 cities in the US. In the US, 11 of the IRC offices provide comprehensive case management services for survivors of human trafficking. 2 of our offices have been engaged in this work for over 15 years. Historically, the IRC has engaged in protection work through the provision of services, as well as through capacity building and outreach efforts, all intended to identify trafficking survivors. The IRC Switchboard program is also the national provider of training and technical assistance for refugee service providers. That combined experience of anti-trafficking service delivery and TTA provision informs our work on this project. Next slide, please. Funded by the Department of Justice, Framework is one of over 20 federally funded training and technical assistance projects that address human trafficking, either as an exclusive focus or part of a broader set of topics. What's different about Framework is our focus on a population versus a service topic, for example, legal services, housing, or employment. So let's review our goals. Our goals are to increase, as you can see on the screen, increase the identification of labor trafficking survivors in the community, improve the quality and quantity of services offered to labor trafficking survivors, and also to enhance partnerships to build a comprehensive coordinated community response. The overarching theme is being able to build self-efficacy, which is a barrier to identification, service provision, and investigation. Additionally, what is important to note is our commitment to a human rights approach. And this means centering survivors and respecting their individual autonomy and viewing trafficking through multiple lenses. And that's as a workers' rights issue, an economic issue, a criminal justice issue, a public health issue, and an immigration issue as well. Next slide, please. Here we've outlined a list of types of resources Framework will be developing, some of which will be available widely, and some that will be tailored to you and your organization. So this is an overview of the full menu to inform requests. And keep in mind this list throughout the presentation. We do welcome your feedback on what product you also would find insightful, and that information can be shared with us during this presentation or through future engagements with Framework as well. Next slide, please. We're committed to conscientious programming that connects service providers and their partners with emerging and best practices informed by reliable data, including and especially the perspectives of people who have survived labor trafficking. To that end, Framework's advisory panel was created. It is comprised of 6 individuals who have a wide variety of skills, experience, and areas of expertise, all of which have survived labor trafficking. The advisory panel provides firsthand insights, and we prioritize topics and develop resources. We also have a growing roster of over 20 subject matter expert consultants who will partner with to develop and deliver trainings, create resources, and provide individualized support. The best way to stay connected is through our website, where you can sign up for our newsletter, submit a request for support, and apply to become one of those subject matter expert consultants. This will also be home of our future resource library. So stay tuned for that, and please visit us at www.frameworkta.org. And now Charlie is going to share with you the results of our needs assessment survey.
Thanks so much, Regina. Hello, everyone. I'm so excited that you're all joining us today. Here's some quick background information on our survey, which was intended to capture a glimpse of the current landscape as we attempt to build those resources to increase confidence in identification, services, and collaboration. As you can see, the majority of our respondents were providers such as case managers, advocates, and management at nonprofit organizations. And today, the information that we're sharing will be all related to provider responses. First, we wanted to gain an understanding of what types of populations providers were serving and if they worked with labor trafficking survivors. But I want to give a quick disclaimer that this survey was opened by people that saw a subject line of labor trafficking or human trafficking and opened the email. This distribution list was focused on providers and particularly OVC funded providers. So with all of that in mind, let's take a look. In this graph, population prevalence is displayed through circle size. 94% of respondents work with human trafficking survivors, 52 served refugees, asylees, and internally displaced persons, 50% worked with survivors of intimate partner violence, 34% unaccompanied minors, 18% with particular racial, ethnic, and religious groups, and 46% worked with sexual assault survivors. We are happy to see that only 4% of respondents stated that labor trafficking survivors were not eligible for services at their organization, but again, that might have to do a little bit with who took the survey. So we are curious in what you all are bringing to today's webinar. So we're going to launch a poll to see what organizations you're representing. What populations do you serve at your organization? You can choose multiple things. Whatever feels most relevant to you as you answer. And if you see something that is on this list and feels really relevant that you want to try and collaborate with others on the chat, go ahead. If there's something missing from this list, go ahead and put that into the chat as well. we're at 3/4 of individuals voted so far, so just give a couple extra minutes. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and share the results. So it looks like the majority of individuals, 97%, which is actually 3% more than our survey, serve human trafficking survivors. Again, potentially a little bit of bias between who clicks on our emails and attends our webinars. And then followed up by refugee, asylee, and internally displaced persons, and sexual assault survivors. So actually a little bit different of a breakdown than our exact numbers, but really, really similar to what we've received in the survey.
And Charlie, I want to add that in the chat it was shared that missing victims as well as people at risk, those are two of the populations that are recommended for that survey.
Thank you. Two additionally important populations. So moving forward, at those agencies, how many survivors do they serve each year? Whether for sex, labor, or both, most respondents shared that their agency worked with 1 to 15 survivors. So we're even, right? Not so much. If you look at the red circles, most agencies worked with more sex trafficking survivors in comparison. So assuming that we're only talking about 50 people, that's still a difference of 550 sex trafficking clients served and 100 labor trafficking survivors served. One reason for this may be that agencies are more likely to screen only for sex trafficking, but an important discrepancy as we move forward in this data and in serving labor trafficking survivors. As some respondents stated in our comment area of the survey, the information gathered in this question is limited to the respondents' knowledge base, experience, and the use of screening tools at their agencies. It's likely that these numbers would be much higher if screening and identification of trafficking survivors was a priority at all agencies and across every department. Thinking of the last slide on annual agency service, we also looked at all-time individual service delivery. How many labor trafficking survivors have you worked with in your career? The majority of respondents, 64%, have worked with less than 24 labor trafficking survivors that they know of in their whole career, especially thinking that most of those organizations stated they worked specifically with human trafficking survivors. That's a little bit of a discrepancy. So thinking back to who was most likely to take this survey and how does that speak to field readiness? Well, we'll talk about this a little bit later. When we were conducting these services, which partners are seen as most valuable in addressing labor trafficking? The leader of the pack in this survey was legal providers, followed by other service providers and community-based organizations, law enforcement, and housing providers. Looking at this list, whether you are just starting to focus on labor trafficking survivors in your work, or if that's your main mission, do a mental check and see where you may be able to bolster collaborations, or if you've got partners in each of these places, give yourself a little pat on the back and feel free to chat in some additional places not mentioned. So across this slide, we have, in addition to our MVPs, the most common referral sources: health providers, internal referrals, domestic violence shelters, and emergency housing programs were some of the top resources, followed by schools and unaccompanied minor shelters. Similar to the last slide, take a look at this chart and consider who may be worth developing a relationship with and doing informational interviews with to gain an understanding of their initiatives to support labor trafficking survivors. It's also just a great way to get some of those text-based referrals. Hey, can you help me out with this information? Those are some of my favorites. Shifting into what we see to get in the way of serving labor trafficking survivors, we asked what were the most common barriers. I have to tell you that this and the following portion were designed with the intention of not only looking at barriers, but also are there other things tied to perceptions in serving this population? For example, the most common barrier that was stated to be was outreach. That was stated to be hard with this population was outreach within immigrant and other impacted communities. This is fantastic because we know that this population has increased vulnerability to labor trafficking, but language was also reported to be a barrier half as often. This may be due to a belief that Spanish speakers are more impacted by labor trafficking, but fingers crossed that everyone just has great language access procedures. 59% stated that labor trafficking survivors are fearful of engaging in services, which could be tied to perceptions again, but is in general a good state of awareness for all trafficking survivors. Next, a lack of referral and proper screening were almost tied at 47 and 49%, and an additional 24% of respondents felt that labor trafficking survivors had needs that were more difficult to serve. Whether it's meeting clients' needs or developing screening and partner referral sources, we here at Framework hope to help you to solve at some of these at your agency and in your area. Of course, because we know that there are barriers across immigrant and all communities, we were curious how coronavirus was further complicating those barriers. We asked providers, how has coronavirus impacted your ability to identify and serve labor trafficking clients? Most respondents said that it's hard to serve clients remotely and that outreach has been a challenge. We also saw that building rapport and partnerships has decreased in mode and opportunity. If anything on this list feels relatable to you and your clients in the last few months, we just want you to be reminded that you're not at all alone. And if you haven't already, consider signing up for our listserv to receive some resources in working with clients remotely. All right, so tools used in identifying clients was one of the main areas people stated that there were barriers to serving labor trafficking survivors. I also want to note that with the changes in programming and funding, come across changes in the field. This chart may represent both starting and seasoned individuals, those with new grants or even tried and true programs. Still, over 50% of providers shared that they were entirely or mostly confident in their screening abilities. For us at Framework, confidence is key. There is a long-standing narrative of the human trafficking field not being prepared or properly trained to meet the needs of labor trafficking survivors, and we believe that that actually impacts the feeling of other agencies being better suited for the population. However, respondents, even after sharing a need for better screening, reported that this was an area of strength for them. So we continue to look at confidence and perception of readiness in other areas. When it comes to serving male survivors, providers are 5% more confident if those men have experienced labor trafficking. With females, providers are 8% more confident if they are sex trafficking survivors. And the reports are pretty even for transgender, sex, and labor trafficking survivors. In general, confidence is stated to be a little lower overall. One thing that makes me wonder is if our perceptions of the common survivor in each group impacts training and resource availability on all genders. So what about general referrals for certain populations? Could that impact confidence? 34% of respondents actually shared that they were not very or somewhat confident with referrals for minors, and 30% of respondents reported feeling not at all to somewhat confident responding to non-English speakers. With perceptions that most labor trafficking survivors are immigrants or foreign nationals, what does that mean for how often organizations are seeking out labor trafficking populations? Let's take a look. So the breakdown for who feels entirely confident is actually the same. However, respondents did show a small decrease in confidence responding to referrals for foreign nationals versus US citizens. So we can So can we infer that this difference might be due to differences in comfort or access to support for non-English speakers? Let us know some of your thoughts. Don't forget that you've got the Q&A feature, and we'll be answering questions at the end of presentation. Continuing perceptions of abilities, we asked survey takers about their beliefs of skill across certain areas. This time, we asked for perceptions of themselves and other stakeholders. The results mirrored what we've been seeing in request interest for technical assistance. There's a narrative about field readiness, and even though I think providers internalize it, so often it's you. True, there's always more to learn and ways to polish, but hey, that's exactly what your friends at Framework are for. Yellow here represents the top areas providers felt skilled. In red, you've got perception of skill levels for stakeholders. There are some large differences, with the biggest one being in skills of trauma-informed care, which might be more of a focused area for providers, even though we know that it's just as important for others like legal teams and law enforcement. We also looked at areas of opportunity. Yellow here represents where service providers felt the least skilled, and red, their perceptions about other stakeholders. These areas were using data to identify vulnerable populations, direct outreach, and screening for labor trafficking. In regards to stakeholders, 50% of providers don't feel that stakeholders have skills in using data to identify potential clients. 44% believe stakeholders could build better skills in outreach. And 39% think stakeholder skills of screening could use some improvement, which is why collaboration and building partnerships is so important to our mission and something that we want to support in future requests. So, looking to the knowledge, there were even more disparities. Here you can see that the stark differences between provider perceptions of themselves and stakeholder understanding of vulnerability, red flags, force, fraud, coercion, and common industries in relation to labor trafficking. This graph shows feelings of being very or entirely knowledgeable. And it seems like a common trend that we don't always have the most belief in our partners' abilities. So why is it so frequent that providers don't see themselves as the best labor trafficking resource? Any thoughts? Put it in the chat. All right. And what about areas that there's felt to be less knowledge? Oddly, we saw some overlap. This, for me, speaks to the variation in starting point of various providers and partners, whether or not that's due to funding streams, turnover, or an expansion of the field. The areas providers felt the least knowledgeable were how victims exit situations and post-trafficking needs. For beliefs of stakeholders, there was a little more to go on. 67% of providers felt that partners could use a little more information on red flags. 64% felt partners didn't have an understanding on how victims exited situations, and 63% felt education on post-trafficking needs would be helpful for stakeholders. What do you all think? Do these areas in general align with your perceptions of yourself and your partners? What do you believe why do you believe they may or may not? Do you think that there are area trends, regional trends? Do you think that there are things you feel your area or partners have done a really great job in to foster collaboration and training? Let us know all about it. As we talk about knowledge and skills, what was the most preferred method of training delivery to increase those knowledge and skill building opportunities? In person. Though I think in-person moments are something we all miss. We're excited to know you all look forward to in-person resources in the future. And I'll hand it over to Megan, who's going to share with you some of our training topics and methods moving forward.
Thanks, Charlie. So what are we going to do with all of that data? Just as a reminder, the survey was intended to inform what it is that we focus on. We didn't want to rely on our own personal experience or some of the assumptions that we might be making. We really wanted to hear from the field in order to prioritize what we're going to focus on. You could go to the next slide, Charlie. One of the big takeaways for us was the recognition of the tremendous amount of diversity of experience within the field. There are so many folks that are just starting out, they're at newly funded programs, or they've been working with a similar population for a long time and they're wanting to dig more deeply into labor trafficking. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there's the folks that have been doing this for a really long time, decades. And so they're looking to increase their capacity and enhance their learning, knowing that in life we're continuous learners. So we wanted to be able to speak to everyone on either end of the spectrum and in between. So as a result, some of the resources we develop are going to speak to folks that are closer to that starting line, and some of the resources are going to be geared towards folks that are, they've already built up some degree of expertise. So these are our three sort of buckets of priorities. The first one is to build up a really strong foundation of understanding around what labor trafficking is, what it isn't, sort of some of the context behind it, so folks have a really strong knowledge base going into service delivery. The second bucket, our goal is to see an increase in the number of labor trafficking survivors identified in communities across the country. And the third bucket is to enhance the experience of survivors when they're engaged in services. So let's look at that first bucket around labor trafficking foundations. Our plan is to, you can go to the next slide, Charlie. Develop over the course of the next year a series of short, self-paced online learning modules that are going to cover the basics of labor trafficking. So each module is only going to be about 20 minutes. It's what they call micro learning. So they're really great short snippets, really digestible and perfect for those moments in your day where you're between meetings, or that time at the end of the day where there's not enough time to start something new, but you need to fill your time with something. So this is going to be the perfect solution for those moments in your day. The target audience is, again, for folks that are newer to the issue, newer or newly funded programs, and folks that are new to labor trafficking, and also for community partners that you're working with who, this isn't what they do on a regular basis. This isn't a population that they're deeply familiar with, but you do send referrals to them and they do provide services to this population. And so really enhancing their knowledge and providing context for the experience of labor trafficking survivors, so they're better equipped to meet their needs and give them a quality experience. And in terms of timeline, we should have the first few modules available by the end of the year, so stay tuned for that. The second bucket around practical skills and tools to increase identification is to do just that. We heard that a considerable challenge for folks is just getting survivors of labor trafficking in the door and identifying them in their communities. So you're not getting referrals, or you don't have a solid screening process. Here are 4 of the topics that we heard via the survey that would be useful to address that challenge. So we have outreach, direct outreach, screening, using data to identify victims and survivors, and building relationships with partners and allies, specifically to connect with those vulnerable and sometimes hard to reach populations. So tell us, of these topics, which one is the most important for you? Help us figure out where should we start to increase your ability to get labor trafficking survivors through your door. We're going to launch a poll here. Take just a few seconds to weigh in. What's most important for you when it comes to increasing identification?
And Megan, while the participants take the survey, there was a question about when will the modules be available. I know that you mentioned later on this year is the best way to get that information.
Yep. So the series will be developed over the course of the next 12 months, but the first several modules will be available before the end of of this year. So again, like the best way to stay in touch with our timeline and the newest release of our resources is to sign up for our newsletter via our website, and you'll be the first to know when they're available. All right, it looks like folks have just about stopped voting, and it's a pretty good mix here. So the winner is screening. A close second is building relationships with partners and allies, outreach, and then using data to identify victims and survivors. So this is, it's pretty parallel with what we saw in the survey. And it really tells us there isn't it's hard to just start one place and solve the problem. It's really sort of the combination of all of these things that's really going to enhance your ability to identify folks. So we'll certainly plan on tackling all of them, but we see that screening is the leader for today. So thank you for participating in that poll. And then lastly, in the third bucket, you can go to the next slide, Charlie, around enhancing service delivery. So when it comes to general engagement with labor trafficking survivors, what we heard from the survey is that confidence is pretty high. So when it comes to things like trauma-informed care, survivor-centered services, and building rapport with survivors, you're feeling pretty confident to do that with this population. Where we heard that there's an opportunity is around building up efficacy working with minors and also non-English speaking survivors. Again, going back to the data that Charlie presented, we thought that it was so interesting. Folks felt more confident working with foreign nationals, but reported less confidence around the language issue. So it's not a matter of the culture necessarily, but it really is that barrier of being able to communicate. So those are the top of the list. Other topics include employment rights and preparation for the workforce, victims' rights and legal services, creating space for survivors to lead, and that includes soliciting and incorporating their feedback to inform programs. Essential partnerships, which you highlighted in the last poll, is really essential. Protecting and supporting your anti-trafficking team. So that would be more of a leadership training, and speaks to the fact that so often, you know, not every anti-trafficking program is big and robust and has a large staff and leadership that is really deeply entrenched in the issue. Often we see smaller organizations that this is a smaller component of the broader work that they do. And that can feel so isolating, especially if you're a single case manager or if you have just 2 case managers and your supervisor is really an expert in another topic. So really helping supervisors understand it and leadership within organizations, how they can really provide a lot of strong support to their anti-trafficking team, be it one person or several people. In addition to that, we have utilizing data to inform your work beyond outreach, just as a separate topic. And then ethical storytelling, which I think is really important to be able to articulate the experience of trafficking without sensationalizing it, and always respecting the ownership, privacy, and confidentiality of survivors and their stories. So we're going to ask for your help again in prioritizing these topics. If you can rank, or you're going to select your top 3 most important topics for us. It just launched, so take a couple seconds to weigh in. I know there's a little bit to weigh through, so we'll give you a little bit of time here. What are your top 3 most important training topics specifically related to enhancing service delivery? You guys are making it tough on us. The responses are all over. Again, it sort of speaks to the fact that we're going to be busy over the course of the next 3 years of this grant. There are so many topics to dive into, but this will help us figure out the starting point.
Keep us busy. If you got any other thoughts, put them in the chat.
We love busy. All right, it looks like voting is slowed down, so I'll end the poll. And victims' rights and legal resources is the winner by a hair at 48%. It looks like, oh, I like this. Creating space for survivors to lead comes in a very close second at 45. And working with minors comes in think at number 3. So that gives us a good sense just in terms of where to start on all of these topics. So thank you so much. And again, if you have ideas about any topics that aren't included in this list or in the previous conversation around increasing identification, please identify those for us by putting your ideas in the chat. All right, so one additional thing that I wanted to note was, in addition to these training opportunities, we're also available for individualized technical assistance and support. So if you would like to pick our brains or work with one of our subject matter experts to think through a tough case that you're working on, or if you're working with your first labor trafficking survivor and just sort of want to say, am I on the right track? Am I thinking about the right things? Is there anything else you can think of? We're here for those conversations too. If you need help thinking through developing policies for your anti-trafficking program specific to labor trafficking, or developing training materials that address labor trafficking, we are here for all of it. We're also very well connected with all of the 20 some odd training and technical assistance projects that are funded through OVC and other federal providers. And so if you're not sure if we're the best resource necessarily, feel free to start with us, and we can refer you to some of those other resources as needed.
Megan, I'm not sure if you saw on the chat, there was a topic recommendation, which is collaboration, and what it really is, how to do it well in order to enhance effective working relationships among the various organizations involved. I mean, I know one of the best practices is that multidisciplinary approach. So
absolutely. And that's one of those topics I think that so often it gets the head nods, right? Like, of course we collaborate, of course we have partners. But partnership is hard, collaboration is hard when you are working with another individual or group and you have a different objective or a different mandate or a different, just idea about what's important or a different goal. It's easy to say we're going to work together, but it's hard often in practice. And so I think we're really interested in getting into the meat of that, not just that you should collaborate or who to collaborate with, but to your point, Anne, about how you do that well. What do you do when conflict arises? What do you do when you aren't working towards the same goals? What do you do when you define survivor-centered differently? So we're really interested into diving into that really practical piece of not just collaboration, but all the topics that we're going to get into. Thanks for that addition.
Yeah, there's a component of it too that is ever evolving. Just thinking now and about some of the current climate, bringing in racial justice organizations to your task forces, ensuring that your organizations are survivor informed for all representative survivors, and looking at your programming, who you're serving, who you're not serving at those moments, and how some of those leaders in those communities can help you move forward.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I think one of the things that comes to mind for me, especially for folks that have been doing this for a while, they rely on their regular partners, and there's a steady stream of referrals from their immigration attorney partners. And you start to wonder after a while, there's more people out there. Who are we not reaching? How can we be more proactive? Who are the groups that are working with these vulnerable populations that we're just not connecting with? And I think about like domestic worker alliances, and I think about unions, and again, going back to the human rights approach and thinking about this as a multifaceted issue. I think so often we think about it as a criminal justice issue and rely on our partners in law enforcement and in legal services, but it's a big, broad, complex topic. And so if we think more broadly about who the partners are in those other areas, I think that's where getting creative about those partnerships will really, really benefit survivors and help the programs identify them.
And I want to add, actually, Charlie and myself were part of a conversation this morning, and we talked about what partners are missing from sometimes that traditional multidisciplinary team. And we talked about it a little bit to reinforce your point about industry specific, right? Particularly if you're seeing a trend as far as labor trafficking, particular industries in your community being used, right? whether it's the working conditions or the schemes that are occurring there. Also the immigrant and workers' rights organizations, as well as culturally relevant organizations. So looking at the populations that you're seeing, where you're seeing, when you're looking at your caseload, or when you're looking at the cases that are coming forward, and trying to identify also those entries, right, into these particular groups, not only provide a support for survivors, but also serve as gatekeepers into these communities where maybe we haven't historically had access.
Great point. I see a note too from Kristen in the chat from OVC. Thank you so much. There is, I think I was on this webinar, but certainly just want to highlight for folks that OVC TTAC, the Training and Technical Assistance Center at OVC, has a bunch of really, really good resources. So if you haven't visited that website, check them out. There's a lot of foundational stuff, and they get into a lot of these topics as well. I'll say that that's, I think the reason that it's so important for us to hear from the field about what's important to you when it comes to labor trafficking specifically is we know a lot has changed since 2000 in the passing of the TVPA. There are a lot of resources out there. People know a lot of things. There are a lot of different, even just federally funded groups, like we mentioned, that are providing support to the field. And so we want to make sure that you're connected with all of those resources, and that the stuff that we're putting together is really zeroed in on bringing labor trafficking more deeply into the spotlight there. So thanks for that reminder, Kristen, about the resources available through OVC TTAC. So we're going to move into taking additional questions, so feel free to keep adding those in the Q&A. I am also going to ask Shirley to put our webinar evaluation link into the chat. So please make sure that you take just a couple minutes to fill that out at the end of the presentation. You're in kind of a powerful position because this is our first webinar. So your influence will be tremendous in terms of defining what this will look like in the future. So please let us know what was great, what we can do better, and we'll take that all into account. So I see there's another. Is there a question in the Q&A, Regina?
Not yet. Folks are probably typing those. So while folks are writing out their questions, Megan, can you talk about why you think that there's a need for labor-focused or labor trafficking-focused TTA, in particular a Project Life framework?
Yeah, we've heard for so many years from survivors and advocates like ourselves that there's this disproportionate focus on sex trafficking within the anti-trafficking field. And, that's when it comes to everything from investigations to the availability of services, not just comprehensive services, but, housing and legal services. So I'm thinking about the TIP report that was just released, right? And we saw that of somewhere just over 8,000 survivors of human trafficking served by DOJ funded programs, something like 62% were sex trafficking compared to 22% labor trafficking. And so I just wonder, what is the ratio in reality of sex trafficking survivors and labor trafficking survivors in the communities, and how can we increase our identification? Again, going back to that connection with labor trafficking survivors, we know that there's a gap there. You look at prosecutions in the last year, 95% of federal prosecutions were sex trafficking. Compared to 5%. That's 12 cases annually. So I think that this is a project focused on a population that, historically, it doesn't get the same amount of attention. And I'll say, even as I'm talking about this, I want to be careful because there's also this sense of competition between the two populations. And it doesn't recognize there's so much overlap between sex trafficking and labor trafficking. And so we want to be sensitive to that. We use language really intentionally about bringing labor trafficking into the spotlight compared to shining a separate spotlight on it, because it's not a separate issue. It's all sort of wrapped up together. We just want to bring more attention, more awareness to it, and really equip the fields to identify and serve folks to the same degree that sex trafficking survivors have access to quality services.
So Megan, thank you for that. And we have a couple of questions on the chat, on the Q&A, and one on the chat. So if you give me a moment, I'll go ahead and begin answering, putting those forward. So the first one on the chat is it common for one victim of labor trafficking seeking, is it common for one victim of labor trafficking seeking services, and that leads to a larger number of victims needing services? For example, a large group being trafficked by the same person / group. What is the best way to work with a large group of people if you're a small team?
Mm-hmm. That's such a great question, and that's come up more and more over the last, handful of years, where we've seen increasing large cases across the country, and the very common experience that service providers, especially the smaller ones, but even the bigger ones, how do you respond to 20 people all at the same time? How do you find housing for 20 people, on the same night? And so I think one key that's really important is to be proactive and anticipate that. So don't wait until you get a phone call from your law enforcement partner, from your immigration attorney who says we have, 50 people or however many people, but you want to have those relationships set up in advance. You want to have those conversations about what the protocol will look like so that you're ready, and so that you have a system of communication too. Really importantly, when you're sharing what with whom and why, so that everyone on the multidisciplinary team there can be prepared for it. And then, of course, regardless of how prepared you are, there's a little bit of scrambling because there's a lot of resources that you need to put together quickly. But again, that's where we come in. That's where the slew of other TTA providers come in to make sure that you're not navigating that on your own, because I wouldn't want to be in that position. I've been doing this for a decade, and there's still so much that I don't know. And it's so much better when you're in partnership with people who have been there. So know that you're not alone if and when that happens. Would you add anything, Regina or Charlie? You've been doing this a long time too.
Sure. One thing that I would like to add is to look at assess your community. Look at what industries, right, are there, or do you live in an area where there is a large agriculture community, or farming, or any other types of meat packing. And so look at potentially what the population is, what are the needs that you can anticipate potentially. So for example, if it's a sector where there are potentially a lot of male victims, where would you house them? Who are the partners? And so I think part of what we can do, and part of like just the general recommendation, and as Megan said, to kind of anticipate and prepare, is to do sort of an assessment of who would be those stakeholders that you would need to include based on the reality of your community. And there are types of trafficking, like labor trafficking, like domestic servitude, where you might see 1 to 2 survivors, but then there are certain areas where, you can more or less anticipate that potentially there might be a larger case. And so that part of that work that you could do ahead of time will definitely, this kind of the work that we engage in a lot of times is reactive to things that happen. So anything that you can do ahead of time will be very, will have a large impact on what happens once a case is identified.
And I want to echo that this collaboration and preparation is important for not only kind of our own well-being and mental health, but also the well-being and mental health of our clients, because it has a negative impact if an individual comes to our door and we don't have the services to be able to meet their needs. If we haven't collaborated with housing providers, or with transportation, or with other partners that we know are going to be needed, like mental health providers or health providers. So just throwing that out there. And I know that kind of ties into this readiness. And I think one of the reasons that people benevolently kind of stay in their area of preparation. And I do want to kind of offer that throughout this presentation, we shared how individuals often do see themselves as the best opportunity for labor trafficking survivors within their communities, the ones with the most knowledge, the ones with the most skills and capabilities, the ones who can meet individuals in a trauma-informed way. And that is incredibly important. And perfection is always something we strive for, but never a requirement. So I just want to offer that for you. Please take it. And on top of that, it is common that that things happen in more of a trickle than a downpour. So a lot of organizations that I know that use clients as ways to find more clients and conduct more outreach, they offer telephone services and texting services and information to individuals. And once you have that one connection, they provide that information to other individuals. And so you kind of get a steady trickle at different outreach moments and initiatives. So not to make individuals too worried that one labor trafficking survivor is going to always go to a group case every single time, and that you need, you know, constant, incredible capacity.
Thank you. I'm going to ask the next question on the Q&A, which is, what are some strategies to get businesses to address labor trafficking and supply chain?
This is a great question. You know, I think back to when I just started out and my dad owned a software manufacturing company, and he thought, okay, well, my daughter's working in anti-trafficking, so she has all the answers. So he said, what can I do? And I said, I don't know. I don't know. I think that we have more answers now. I think what can be tough is the fact that you know, when you look at labor trafficking as an economic issue, it's not always easy to make the decisions to make sure that your business isn't knowingly or unknowingly complicit in trafficking of human beings. And it really starts with a strong will to make the necessary changes within a business. And that comes from knowing about human trafficking, that it exists, what it is, that it exists in the community, and the ways in which that businesses might be, again, unknowingly perpetuating that. So that's where those relationships are really important, where you can start with raising the awareness and getting the buy-in of leaders from businesses, and then start having the conversation about what you can do. What we can do is refer you to a group called Stronger Together. They're based in the UK, but they also have programming here in the US, and they work directly with businesses on supply chains to help make sure that they're doing everything within their power to make sure that they're not, again, complicit in human trafficking at some point along the way. I don't know, Shirley, can you put that web address in the chat for folks to check out and utilize that in your partnerships as they develop with businesses in your community?
Yeah, and I want to add that sometimes it's as simple as, I mean, I've asked this, I've asked folks in presentations, because I've done presentations on this specific topic in the past, of, have you invited businesses, for example, or those interested who've asked this question, have you invited them to your task force meetings, to your coalitions? Because there may be ways for them to become involved, but they just don't know how. And so I think making them a part of those conversations, or making them part of, and maybe they might not be a direct service provider, but they can engage in, they could be a partner for employment for survivors, or maybe they're more on the, we want to share this information with our staff. So, you know, let's do trainings, let's engage in public awareness campaigns. And so I think that there's ways for them to get involved. And sometimes it's just as simple as engaging them, having them join you, being part of conversations, and it just starts with that.
And I'll just add one thing that I love about that question is it acknowledges that no single group of advocates is going to end human trafficking on their own. We're not going to do it as social workers. We're not going to do it as attorneys. We're not going to do it as law enforcement. That it really is going to take everybody to examine the role that they play in their work and in their lives, and the little piece that they can do to sort of to snip away at the issue of labor trafficking and human trafficking more broadly. So I think that's great that service providers are taking it upon themselves to start those conversations and bring in other folks who may not, naturally gravitate toward this issue, but to raise awareness and bring them into the fold, recognizing they have a role to play. Great question.
I'm going to switch to questions in the chat. Elizabeth, who's had this question for a bit, so thanks for waiting. She said that she's so excited for us and this important work, and she wants us to clarify if the TA is limited to criminal justice focused stakeholders, if we're able to work across disciplines and engage with providers on the public health / healthcare side of things.
Absolutely. Yeah, that was one of the questions that we wrestled with internally ourselves is, how narrow is the scope of this project? We are OBC funded, and so it's really important that we're supporting the many service providers they're funded through OBC. But that said, a theme throughout this entire presentation has been that of partnership and collaboration. It's not just service providers doing this work, it's all of the partners that they're bringing in for the community-based comprehensive approach. And so we have the ability to work with anybody that's involved in service delivery, whether that's, housing providers or any of the other, public health side. Absolutely.
And a follow-up question is, I'm curious if your surveying of the field has yielded any promising practices, suggestions for victim advocacy when it comes to forced criminality as a form of labor trafficking, especially when it comes to working with law enforcement whose priorities and game do not always align with social service and healthcare providers.
Mm-hmm. That's a great and advanced, maybe not that advanced, it's pretty common topic. It didn't come up in our survey, which is pretty limited, but I think that is definitely a topic for us to explore, including and bringing in some subject matter experts, because that's certainly a difficult one to tackle.
Okay, I believe that I know we're almost at time, and I think that those are all our questions for now. I don't know if anybody else has anything else they'd like to add.
It looks like Charlie's put a couple different resources into the chat, so check that out. Yeah, and just with our last couple minutes, I want to thank Charlie and Regina for walking us through framework and the data from the survey. And thanks to everyone who joined us today. Again, this is our first webinar, so I think we're starting off strong. We're going to take all of your feedback to heart and figure out exactly the next topic that we're going to tackle. So don't forget to fill out our very brief evaluation on the webinar. If you haven't already, again, visit our website, www.frameworkta.org. Sign up for our newsletter. You can also submit a request for assistance there. And yeah, we look forward to connecting with you again soon. Thanks so much, everyone.